Hello and welcome everybody. Today we'll be going over Laravel in depth to prepare ourselves for the certification exam. And in this video, we'll be talking about caching. So first of all, what is cache? Well, it's simply a reserved storage location that collects temporary data to help things load faster. In our case, that will be our website, but it can be used in other circumstances as well, such as in mobile applications and desktop software. It essentially acts like a memory bank, allowing the website or application to retrieve data faster. Laravel out of the box supports several different forms of caching, including database, file, memcache, Redis, DynamoDB, among others. For this video, I'll be going over file, database, and Redis. Using the file cache store. Laravel's default cache driver is file. We can see that here within config cache that it points to the .env file. And then if we go over to the .env file, we can see that it's pointing to file here as well. Then if we go down the config cache file, all the way down to file, we can see actually where it is being stored. So it is going to the storage path, framework, cache, data folder. So let's go ahead and see where that would be. So here in our application, we have storage, framework, cache, and data. We can see that's empty now since we have no cache. For all of our commands using cache, we can use the cache facade, which is simply the capitalized word cache with 2 semicolons. We can see that here within the aliases array within the config app.php file. So in the terminal, let's run php artisan tinker. And then here we have our shell to test our commands. So let's test out the cache. For all of our commands using cache, we can use the cache facade, which simply is the capitalized word cache with 2 semicolons. Now let's imagine we want to store an item in our cache store. We can do this in several different ways. First, we can use the put method. This accepts 3 different arguments. The first is the key, the second is the value, and the third is the amount of time that we want to store this item in cache. If we leave the time value off, it will be stored indefinitely. So let's store this for maybe 300 seconds. After hitting enter, we can see that the function returns true, so the value should be stored. Let's go ahead and retrieve it just to prove the point that it was stored. In order to retrieve this item, we can use the get method, and we'll simply use the key here as well. So we get our value from there. Here you can see that we get our value. But how did this happen? Well, let's first take a look in our file system to see where it has been stored. So as we talked about before, it will be stored in storage, framework, cache, data folder. Then we have this interesting A6 folder. So A62F folder, okay. And then we have this file, which seems like a hash with DE at the end. And then we have the value. Well, let's go investigate. We'll see what is this all about. So as we talked about before, we are calling the cache facade. So the first place to look is in that facade itself. As you can see here from the doc block, we get our methods that are available to us and as well as where they can be found. And of course, we used the put method just a second ago. So let's go to Illuminate Cache Repository. And let's go find the put method. So here we have our put method. We can see here that it accepts the key, value, as well as TTL. If you're curious, it means time to live, which is a bit of a morbid abbreviation representing how many seconds our item will remain in cache. Note that this is in seconds and it is, of course, optional, as here is set to null. Also note that we have quite a few options here that may not be obvious at first glance. We can save the key as an array, and we can leave the TTL blank, as it is optional, and this will save the item indefinitely. So if we have set the seconds and they are negative, then note that it will remove this from the cache. So it will use the forget method. So there we can see where we're storing the item, right? We're using this store. So where is this coming from? So if we go back, see where the store method is coming from, it looks like it is coming from Illuminate Contracts Cache Store. So we get here and we see that the file does have a store interface and a put method, but this seems to be a bit of a dead end. So let's try this from another perspective. Remember that our configuration for the cache driver is set to the file store. So if we go into Illuminate Cache File Store, we can see that we also have the put method. Then we can see here at the top of the put method that is actually creating a path. If we go to the protected path method, we can see that our key is then being inserted. We take the array of the first two characters from the SHA-1 hash of the key. From there, we use these two parts to create the folder structure within the framework cache data file. This explains the two folders that we can see here. Let's go ahead and dump it. Okay, yes, we can see we have A6 and 2F. These were our folders that we have here in the storage framework. Say A6 2F. But exactly what does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and see what the SHA-1 of our key is. So we have to do SHA-1 of the word key, and there we go. So that is what it was. So what's going on here is that it is creating this directory. It's imploding the parts, which is the slice of the array of the SHA-1 of the key, into two of the folders for these two folders, and then the file name itself is just that hash, as we can see here down below. So it's the SHA-1 hash of the name of the key, right? So that's what we get right there, and that matches up right here perfectly. Okay, let's go back to our put method and see what else is happening. So we have that path, yeah, so we know where exactly it's putting it, and then the contents right here are this expiration, seconds, serialize, and the value. So let's understand what expiration actually means. So if we go to expiration, so this is the seconds that will push in there, and then it'll give us the time available at seconds. So if we dump time out there, let's see, let's restart Tinker and put that in there, and then we get this number right here. If you're not familiar with it, that's actually just a Unix timestamp. So what it will do is add the seconds to the current time in Unix, and you'll get when that item should be removed from cache. Going back to our put method in the file store class, we can see that our content is this expiration. So using this expiration method on the seconds and concatenating it with a serialized value. Let's take a look at what this serialized value actually is. And so if you remember, my value that we used was literally just the word value. So let's see what Tinker gives us there. And it is that S:5 value. So let's take a look. And so that is what this is right here. All right, so that pretty much explains what's happening here, right? So here is where we're going to store the cache. The folder system here is basically the first 4 characters in the hash, and the file is the name of the hash. Then in here, we have that serialized value as well as a Unix timestamp. So that is essentially where it's going. So in addition to put, we also have an add method. The distinct difference is that if the key already exists in cache, then the add method won't do anything and it'll simply return false. So here we'll be using the add method, and our key will be key, value will be value, and the time to live will be 10 seconds. First time we do it, yeah, it'll go ahead and tell us true. Next time we do it, it'll be false. Why? Well, because that 10 seconds hasn't expired. So if we wait for just maybe a few more seconds, then it will come back and tell us true, because that time has expired and this cached item will have been deleted. So let's go ahead and try that one more time, and there we go. So we can see that it has been added back to the cache. In terms of time, or time to live, we can pass in seconds as we have been doing, or we can pass in a date time instance representing the expiration time. So here you can see that I have now, and I'm adding the seconds, or rather I'm adding 10 seconds, which is exactly what I have been doing. So that will end up being the same thing. But the nice thing about this is that I can maybe add minutes, I could add hours, I could add any sort of different time there. And that's maybe a little bit easier to read, to add maybe 10 hours instead of multiplying seconds times 60 and then minutes times 60 to get hours, etc., etc. So that just makes it a little bit more readable. Finally, you can also store items indefinitely using the forever method. This, of course, doesn't need any time to live value. Then, to retrieve the items from the cache, we have already seen the get method. But here are several available to us. So we have this get method. Of course, it gives us the value. But you can also pass a second argument as a default if the value of the key is not found. So imagine if we have get default. So this will pass us the value, right? So because we already have that. But imagine here, let's just say whatever, key 3. This will give us default. Why? Well, because key 3 does not exist in the cache. And so this is kind of our backup value. You can also pass a closure as a default value as well. You can also use the has method to determine if the item exists in the cache. So here, just testing if key is there, and it'll return true. Whereas if I say key something else, it will return false because I do not have that item in the cache. Then you can also increment and decrement values given that these values are integers. The default increment is 1, but you can pass a second argument indicating a different value. So imagine I set the score here to 1. If I'm incrementing that score, of course, it'll go to 2, 3, 4, etc. But if I pass in 10, well, that will go to 14, 24, etc. We have increment and we have decrement as well, which will essentially just subtract it, and I can subtract by 1 here as well. You can also search the cache for a certain key, and if it isn't found, then you can set that value on the fly with the remember forever method. So imagine you had a user in the database and you needed to retrieve this information, and the first time that you went to retrieve this information, yes, you went to the database and got it, but then from there on, you would get that from the cache. Note that you can also set the expiration if you simply use the remember method, and here the second parameter would be that expiration in seconds. So your callback would be the function, and of course you would return, in this example, that user given that the ID is the same as the ID that you pass in. And then from then on, after the first time that it had that database query, it would put that in the cache, and from then on, it would take that user's information from the cache. Finally, you can also retrieve a value and then immediately delete it from cache with the pull method. So imagine we go in here and we want to pull the key. First time, it'll give us the value, but the second time it will give us null because the item has been deleted from the cache. Then, while adding items is important, it is also important to remove them. To remove an individual item, you can simply use the forget method. So here we set the value, we set the key to key and value to value, and now here we will forget that key. And if I want to try to get key, we can see here that that is null, or if we want to see if we have that key, we can see that that is false. There is another way of doing this by simply setting the expiration to 0 or even a negative number, although I'm not sure why exactly you would want to do it this way. So if you did that, and then if you tried to do get key, then this will end up being null, right? Because that expiration has already happened. I'm really not sure why you would ever want to use this instead of using just the forget method. But anyway, that is available to you. And finally, if you want to clear the entire cache, you can just use the flush method. So we go here to flush, and that will remove everything. So that's how we would do most of the caching in the file system, using the database cache store. To set up the database store, we first need to go to our .env file to change the cache driver to database. With the database cache driver, we need to set up a table in our database to store these cached items. We can do this simply with the artisan command. So php artisan cache table. This will create a migration in our database migrations folder. We can see here that there are simply 3 columns: the key, which must be a unique string, the value, and an integer for the expiration. That integer, as we could see before, is a Unix timestamp. Let's run our migration and try this out. All right, so after we have run php artisan migrate, we can see that we have created the cache table. And here in SQL Pro, we can see that here we have that table, and we have the 3 columns: key, value, and expiration. Now let's go ahead and open up Tinker again and try this out. All right, now let's do cache add, and then we'll add our key and our value. Of course, this can be something else more useful. And then we'll add maybe 300 seconds. All right, so far so good, no errors. Let's go back to SQL Pro, refresh the database, and there we go. So we have our key. Well, it looks kind of similar. So we have this prefix right here. So Laravel Cache, we'll have to figure out where that is coming from. But then we go, here's our key. As we saw in our previous example, we have the serialized value right here as well. And then the expiration in the Unix timestamp. But let's go ahead and figure out where is this prefix coming from. Going back to the Illuminate Cache folder, we can see that we have a file named database store. Here we have the database store class, which has all the methods we need to use for the cache, including the put method. Here, as we saw before, we have the serialized method for the value, like we did in the file system, and the expiration in Unix, as we did before. However, for the key, we have this prefix method. If we go back to the cache config file, and then at the bottom, we can see where this is actually being configured. So the cache items keys prefix is either set in the .env file as cache prefix, or it is the slug of the app name plus the word cache. So that makes sense about what we have before, right? So our app name, well, we left it as Laravel, right? And then we get this underscore cache followed by the key. For the rest of the methods, they are the same as for the file system. You can use put, add, and forever methods to save items, as well as pull, forget, and flush methods to remove items as usual. The only other method to point out here is the store method. Since we now have the two caching methods set up, we can use the store method in which we would choose which of the methods we would like to use. For example, we can store using file or database. So for example, let's just to store, we'll put, hey, Brad. So if we're using file, remember that will bring us back to storage, framework, cache, data, and then whatever this is probably, hey, Brad, right? Because that is the SHA-1 hash of the word hey. Or if we wanted to save this in the database, we can do the same thing. Let's call it database. Then let's go back to SQL Pro, refresh the database. So our key, we have the hey right there, and then we have the value, which is Brad. So here we can see that with the store method, we can use different types of cache using the Redis cache store. So for Redis, we'll actually have to pull in another package, which is predis. So to pull in this package, we'll have to run composer require redis. Now in our .env file, let's go ahead and change the cache driver from database to Redis. And then if you remember, so we just installed predis, whereas the Redis client that is default for Redis, so this is config database, is PHP Redis, and we will want to change this to predis. So if we go back to PHP Artisan Tinker, and then we set cache, set Brad test, there we go, that is working again, and we can also set and get it as well. The one last thing that we need to do is make sure that we have Redis installed on our local machine. And of course, whenever we have our website out in production, we'll need to have Redis on our server for production as well. So on a Mac, if you have Homebrew, all you'll need to do is brew update and then brew install Redis. Now that we have updated Homebrew and installed Redis, well, actually you can see that I already have Redis on my machine, but that's how you do it, right? So brew update and then brew install Redis. So now that we have Redis installed, let's go ahead and start it up. So that would simply be brew services start Redis. Okay, so successfully started Redis. Looks good. Let's just try it out. So we can try it with the Redis CLI, and let's just send ping, and we should get back pong. All right, now let's go back to Artisan Tinker and go ahead and try this again. So let's say we add the key, get a value, and let's say 30 seconds. So yes, it is working. And then we can say cache get key, and we get our value back. Great. So this is fine, but it doesn't really use Redis to its full extent. To do that, we'll have to use the Redis facade. So using the Redis facade, we can use the set method, and we set the key and the value, and then we can also get that key and get the value using the key here as well. We can also check these out on the Redis CLI, and let's just type out keys, and we can see that we have a prefix here as well. So that's Laravel database, and then we have the name of our key, which was key. And if we go back into the database configuration for Redis, we can see that we have options here with that prefix. So we can set this Redis prefix within the .env file. Otherwise, it will take the slug of the app name, which is set in the .env file. If it's not, it'll take Laravel, and then it'll add underscore plus the database. Okay, so that's all well and good, but it seems to be the same thing as all the other caching methods, right? Wrong. So we have really just touched the surface of using Redis. Let's check something out here. Go to redis.io/commands and you get an entire list of all these commands that you can use with Redis. I obviously won't go over all of them now, but just for the sake of time, but I will go over some that I have used, which are pretty powerful. So with set, you can set one value at a time. But with mset, you can set an entire associative array all at once. So here, what I'm doing is setting employee 1 as Brad, employee 2 as Jeff, manager 1 as Bob. Then another great feature about Redis is that you can search for the keys based on search parameter. So here we have the asterisk being anything after EMP, right? So our employee 1 was Brad, employee 2 was Jeff. And so here we can see those two keys all out. So that's Laravel's caching in a nutshell. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to write in the comments section below. And if you're planning on taking the certification exam, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. All right, thanks everybody. Take care.